Should historians engage with films or ignore them as they did for a long time? Since films are integral to media, which shapes public history, historians cannot ignore them, although historians remain divided, as they usually are, in their choice of sources and methods. The realization that professional history can ignore films at its peril dawned upon some film historians in the 1930s. Since then, film history has grown as a discipline steadily in some countries, which ironically excludes India, which produces the largest number of films in the world. This presentation with Professor Anirudh Deshpande is about the possible questions and methods which historians must address in their engagement with film as history and source of history. Now, who is Professor Anirudh Deshpande? Anirudh Deshpande was actually a speaker with us, and I'm bringing him on board. Good evening, sir. How are you?
Good evening. I'm fine. Thank you very much for having me again.
All right, so wonderful to have you. So, Professor Anirudh Deshpande is at the Department of History, Delhi University. He teaches not only modern and early modern Indian history, but also European history. He's also the author of a number of books, including The British Raj and its Indian Armed Forces, 1857 to 1939, which was published by OUP. His second book is on British military policy in India, 1900 to 1945, Colonial Constraints and Declining Power, and was published by Manohar. He's also the author of Class Power and Consciousness in Indian Cinema and Television. This was published by Primus in 2009. So there are other books, The First Line of Defense, Glorious 50 Years of the Border Security Force, BSF, there's Hope and Despair, Mutiny, Rebellion, and Death in India. And then, of course, the recently published and interesting, the very interesting book, The Practice of History, Essays in Search of the New Past, which was published by Akar Books. So I think Dr. Razavi has insisted that everyone reads this book as well. Now there are other other things that he has done. There are academic papers, commentaries, reviews, and numerous articles since 1987 in journals and newspapers, such as the Indian Economic Review and Social History Review, so studies in history and economic EPW, and then of course there is Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History, Contemporary India, book reviews, and lots of things are happening. He's also a commentator on India's only bilingual journal, Forward Press, dedicated to social justice. Now, there are so many things, and if I start speaking all these things that I have on my bio for you, sir, it will take a lot more time. But I will let you have the floor now. And shall we talk about history and cinema? What exactly is the relationship?
How much time do I have, Shavita?
So you
How
said
much time
five
are you
hours.
giving me? About an hour?
So
Okay,
you
so
said five.
no, I just joked with you. I was saying when you said how much would you like to speak? I said 5 hours. I was kidding with you, basically, to make you laugh a little. So, well, I mean, this is this is part of my uh, part of my personal, emotional, and academic and historical engagement with films, which goes back to my childhood, from when I really thought, and I actually, I used to. I used to be fascinated by film. Some of my friends who are, who discuss films with me and with whom we have a constant interaction on film music, or the film genres, or directors, and so on and so forth. They are all my fellow travelers. So these are, what I'm going to do today is to share a few ideas with my listeners about what possible relationship can there be between cinema and the historian, or as you can put it the other way around, film and history. I would like to begin my presentation with what D.W. Griffith, who produced one of the first cinema magnums called The Birth of a Nation, which is basically a history of the United States as it came out of the Civil War of 1861 to 65, and this became a very important film in the American audience's self-perception of themselves as Americans. And this film, amongst others such as the westerns and other genres of film, which actually celebrated the so-called pioneering spirit of the Americans and so on and so forth. All these films actually began to play a very important role. They, in fact, played a very important role, at least in the first 20, 30 years, informing the modern conception and the modern identity of Americans. And as A.J.P. Taylor was very fond of saying, films had become, they had become a social habit by the 1930s and 40s when cinema halls were operating in most Western cities, and the cinema halls that started operating in the colonies, and the influence of film and the cinematograph in a variety of ways began to spread from America and from France and from England and other countries into those countries who would later on be called the third world, including India, where the where also the film industry began to, Indian film industry is of course almost as old as the Hollywood film industry, and we have the first films coming out in the almost coterminous with the Great War period, and then of course you have the 1920s and 30s, the times of the silent movies and so on and so forth, and after that, of course, you have the talkie system. So you have an entire history of cinema, and D.W. Griffith very early made a prediction, and he said that very soon in future a time would come when more, and of course, I mean, his film, the birth of a nation, has been criticized as a as a as a defense of white America against against another America which could have been possible as a consequence of the emancipation of slavery, but that's a different story altogether. Let's not be detained by that. And D.W. Griffith said one thing which played a very important role in the way we began to look at cinema, especially historians began to look at cinema from the 1920s, 30s onwards. He said in future a time would come when cinema archives would be the place where people would go and read history. And how they would do it, they would go to this cinema archives where film reels would be kept in boxes, and there would be projectors or other machines on which they would see these films, and good films, historical films or social films or cultural films, other kinds of films would be available to them. And instead of spending hours in libraries poring over books and articles and peer reviewed journals and so on, these people would then watch a well informed good film and be acquainted with history in a matter of 2 hours. For instance, I mean, he would the example which he quoted was, let's say, if somebody wanted to know the history of, let's say, the Napoleonic Wars or the Battle of Waterloo, all he would do would be to basically see a very good film, 2 or 3 films on the Battle of Waterloo, and be very well informed about, and very emotionally also informed about a very important, great historical event which shaped European and world history in some ways. So very early, this prediction was made, and film appeared in the 19. I mean, it began to emerge, especially in the interwar period, from let's say 1919 to 1939. Film emerged as a very important tool of not only of history, of showing people culture, showing them colonies, but it also emerged as a very important tool of state propaganda, which was used to great effect by fascist cinema, which developed after Mussolini came to power in Italy in 1922. And of course, we all know how fond his friend in Germany was of films, and how films were used by the Nazis on a very large scale too. to to propagate their ideology amongst the and brainwash the German people into into gaining their support for a very large genocidal war which was perpetrated on Europe by the Nazis from 1939 onward. So the impact of film was understood by a large number of people. Unfortunately, the way history had developed since the 19th century mm, was it started inveighing against the seriousness with which film ought to have been understood by the historians right from the beginning. Of course, to sum up, I mean, when I'll start summing up this presentation, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But right now, I would like to, I would like to, I mean, I have in my first slide, which I think you people can see. I have two positions on the film. The contemporary position is given by Robert Brent Toplin, who's a film historian, well-known film historian. He very clearly says that gone are the days when professional historians turned up their noses at suggestions that film sometimes should figure prominently in discussions about the past. And then you have another very important, a methodological position on film taken by another film historian and a historian of ideas, Justin Smith, who says film history must embrace the interdisciplinary openness which has enlivened other branches of social history. Films never exist in isolation and are always related to the wider cultural output of an era. So now let me come to a model which I have which I have prepared for students and teachers who are interested in looking at cinema from a historian's perspective, from the perspective of the historian's craft and the historical method. So this is the triangulated model which I am presenting, triangulated model to understand the film. You'll find that on this model, you have on the top one point of the triangle makes up the filmmaker. Who's the filmmaker? The filmmaker is the director, the producer. There's a team. It is the filmmaker is the filmmaker comprises a team of people, a collaborative collective exercise which produces a commodity. In the same way as a factory produces a commodity, or in the same way as a printer produces a book in which the writer, the printer, the publisher, they are all together. Similarly, filmmaking is an industry. So we talk about the film industry simply because the film industry produces a commodity. And this commodity is called cinema or film or documentaries or whatever you may prefer to call it, you may videos or whatever. So who are the filmmakers? The filmmakers are film directors, producers, script writers, screenplay writers, costume designers, financiers, media analysts, advertisers, film distributors, cinema hall owners, and so on and so forth. This is an entire structure which produces a commodity. At the other end, and there is an interaction between this process which produces the commodity, and the consumer of the commodity. And who is the consumer of the commodity? The consumer of the commodity is the audience. The question which we ask of the audience is, why does the audience like or dislike a film? And in this we talk about what is called the emotional quotient of films. If audiences love a film, why? If audiences flock to the theater to see a film many times, and through interviews and through newspaper reports and so on, we come to know, in fact, we have more information about how many people actually go to watch how many films. And I'm sure you've often heard of people who have watched a particular film 20 times or 18 times or 30 times or 40 times, and we ourselves keep watching some films all the time. So what is it about a film which people like or dislike? And after that we go to the question of why they dislike or like a film. So remember one thing, when we understand film, we must understand the first relationship, and that is the relationship between the filmmaker and the audience, because there is no commodity without the consumer of that commodity, and there is no consumer without a commodity. So if there is a film, there must be an audience, and if there is an audience, there must be a film. So there's a dialectical relationship between the film and its consumer, the audience. Then, of course, the third corner is taken up by the historian, who interacts with both these elements of the entire film producing and film consuming experience. So historian is if the historian, of course, I'm assuming that some historians are interested in cinema and they'd like to ask questions of cinema to be able to understand social and cultural history in the context of cinema better. The historians must question both these aspects of filmmaking. He must question the filmmaker, and he must also question the audience. He must be in dialectical relationship with both these people, the filmmakers as producer of the commodity, audiences as consumers of the commodity. Now, let me go to the questions which must be asked by the film historians. And it is in the answering of these questions that it is when we look at the answers to these questions that we, number one, start asking more questions, which leads us to a deeper research of a particular topic on which cinema is made, which actually deepens our historical understanding of processes, which, of course, as viewers, some of you might understand. The questions to be asked by the film historian is very. I've got about a series of, let's say, about 8 questions, which the film historian has to ask of his subject. The first question is, who are the film producers and directors? Are they men or women? Are they progressive or reactionary? So let's say if you look at a film of the 1950s and you say, let's say you want to look at Mughal Azam, the first question which you have to ask is, who was K. Asif? What kind of films did he produce? Uh, why did he produce this film? What was his ideological orientation? uh, Whether this film was produced to showcase the secular nature of Indian history, or whether it was a nation building film. What kind of film was this? So these are the questions which you have to ask. What is the perspective of the camera? The perspective of the camera depends upon who the filmmaker and film producer is. The second obvious question is the topic for a film. Why is a particular topic for a film chosen? If a film director, if a film team, filmmaker team is producing a historical film, why are they making a historical film? It's not simply enough to understand what the film is conveying to you in terms of meaning, or in terms of mythology, or in terms of legend, or in terms of actual factual correct authentic history. I think an equally important question to ask is about the topic of the film. Why is that film being made at a particular time when it is being made? It is the kind of question which we expect our research students to ask when they begin their research degrees. I mean, people come and ask me, students. So I always ask them. I always question them, query them. I ask them why they want to work on a particular topic, because this question why is extremely important. And from this basically two consequences follow. And since I consider all film political film, uh, the political exigency of a film, and the other question is, no film is apolitical. If you consider all films to be political, in the sense that all films relate to power in some way or the other, it could be cultural power, it could be social power, or it could be openly speaking political power. You have the political agency within the film, political exigency within the film. So, and that is connected to the choice of the topic and the research which goes into making the film, and of course the understanding of the audience which the filmmaker has. So all these things are connected. The third important question is, what is the background of the filmmakers? So when you want to understand a film, let's say you want to understand a film made by Guru Dutt in the 1960s, you want to check out, you have to check out the background of Guru Dutt. What kind of films did he make? What was his understanding of culture? What was his understanding of society? What was his understanding of gender? What was his understanding of tragedy? And this is where the ideological framework within which the filmmakers work becomes very, very important. Because what exactly are the filmmakers trying to convince you of? And here the question of the discursive nature of film becomes important. What kind of discourse is this film actually conveying to you? If it is talking about tragedy, what kind of tragedy is that film about? If it's talking about filmmaking itself, like Gurudat does in, let's say, Pyasa or Kagaz Ke Phool, what kind of of poetry or whatever, what sort of film is that? Why is he trying to say that to you or to the audience at a particular time? So that background of the filmmaker is extremely important. So here, of course, you look at film, the filmmaker as the author. The background of the author is very important. If you look at Satyajit Ray, or you look at Shyam Benegal, or you look at Mrinal Sen, or you look at any other, or Francis Ford Coppola, or you look at Martin Scorsese, you have to go into their background. So the film historian has to do a fair amount of research to understand the psychology of the filmmaker, the socioeconomic background of the filmmaker, his training as a filmmaker, what kind of methods does he employ, and so on and so forth, to be able to develop a comprehensive understanding of cinema. And then, of course, what kind of films comprise their genre? Can you really actually identify individuals with their with genre? I mean, so, do authors belong to a particular genre of filmmaking? So if you really talk about Martin Scorsese, for instance, who's one of my favorite filmmakers, Martin Scorsese is a master of crime films. So why does he do that? What message do his crime films have for people, and so on and so forth? So, and is that the only if that's the only genre he or film he has made? Why has he made that kind of genre his forte, and so on and so forth? These are the questions which the film historian has to ask to be able to make sense of film. Fourth, what is the aim of the filmmaker? Is it mass, escapist entertainment? Is it educative, or is it political? Fifth, is the film a feature film, or historical, or documentary, or reportage? Why has the film been made? And if the film is a period historical, why is the period historical being made at a particular given time? For instance, if you have a film on, let's say, Rani Lakshmibai made today, or if you have, let's say, about 10 12 13 years ago, you had a series of 4 or 5 important films which came out on Bhagat Singh. Why did suddenly 3 or 4 filmmakers think of making a film on Bhagat Singh? What was it at that? What was so important? What was so important of the historical of about the historical developments which were happening in India at that time, let's say 15 16 years ago, or 12, 13, 14 years ago, when it was important for Bhagat Singh movies to be made. So if you really want to look at, let's say you look at the Bhagat Singh movie, Bhagat Singh film as a typical genre film which is produced periodically in Hindi cinema, then you'll have to compare Bhagat Singh movies of the 1960s, maybe if there was a film produced in the 80s, or you have the film produced in the 2000s. You really have to go through these films to see whether what kind of change in the imagery of Bhagat Singh has taken place. How do these different films interpret Bhagat Singh differently? What is the relationship between the interpretation offered to the audiences of Bhagat Singh, and what readings do we have on him, or what his actual historical record is, and so on and so forth. So why has the film been made, and what is the purpose of making that film? That's extremely important. These are extremely important theoretical and methodological questions which the filmmaker has to answer. Then the sixth question is very important: who is the script writer of the film? Because without script, there is no film, unless, of course, you're talking of silent films, which also have a script, which also have a script which is basically silent, but it has a story which is silent. But without script, there's no film. So all good films usually have good scripts. Who is the script writer of the film? Let's say if the script writer of a film is somebody like Vijay Tendulkar, or scriptwriter of somebody, a scriptwriter for a film is of, let's say, Salim Javed. What kind of scriptwriters are these people? What sort of scripts do they write? And because it is the script which provides the film with the language, what is the nature of this language? And here, the film historian has to pay particular attention to the language within which the film conveys its meaning. It's not merely the scene, it is the combination of the mise en scene and the language and the vocabulary through which the film works and becomes an impressive medium of conveying knowledge to the people. That remains extremely important. So, once you look at the script writer, it is your duty as a historian to look at the ideological inclination of the script writer also. What school of thought does he belong to? Which university did he go to? What sort of is he a playwright? Is he a novelist? If he's a novelist, what kind of novels has he written? If he's a playwright, what sort of plays is he known for? What kind of controversies have happened, around his scripts and his plays earlier, and so on and so forth. So these are things which you have to. Has he been associated with theater, for that matter? Is he a is he primarily a theater script writer? Is that a film adaptation of a theater script? So these are things which you have to, which the film historian also has to concern himself with. Now, if the film if the film is a historical film, which is, let's say, period set costume drama or biopic for that matter, are historians involved as subject experts in its making? If they are, what is their historical viewpoint? What kind of historians are involved in the making of a historical film, which could be a period set costume drama or a biopic? And then you have to see whether these historians are known for particular ideological inclinations, whether these historians are known as credible historians within the community of historians, whether these historians are, whether they are known for producing legends and fake histories in the name of history, and so on and so forth. And you have to begin the analysis of the historical film by this understanding. Finally, you have the eighth question, according to which you must see whether the film is based on a work of history or historical fiction or novel, and if that is so, what is the nature of these texts. So, if it's based on a novel, it is the job of the historian to go through the novel and see whether the essence of the novel is reproduced in cinema. Because, see, nothing can be an exact reproduction of a particular text, but if the truth of a particular situation, or if the narrative is a truthful account, not an exact account, but the truthful account of what might have transpired between individuals, or what might have happened to a person's life, then you can really appreciate that film as a true historical movie. Anyway, from there you go on to what often film historians and film analysts talk about, and that is reading the film. How should the historian relate to film, and how do you read the film? In fact, there are many ways of reading a film. I have chosen four for the students who are possibly listening into this program. One, the historian can see the film as a historical source. And here you can use feature films, documentaries, and the historical film as well as a historical source, number one. Because these are these are, minds are very impressionable. Audiences often start believing what they watch on the screen. Audiences get taken in completely by feature films. They also feature films, especially feature films which resonate with their own cultural values and their social values, and so on. Audiences can be influenced by documentaries, documentaries are very powerful media for conveying histories of things, of people, commodities, histories of countries, and so on. And now you have the internet flooded with documentaries of hundreds of kinds which people watch, and I would say some of those documents are very good. In fact, some of those documents are much better. Documentaries are much better, and they tell stories of certain countries in a condensed form much better than many books actually many textbooks and other books end up doing. So, in this case, the footage is used by the historian to support his generalizations based on archival and other research. So, he uses the film as another tool in the same way as he uses, let's say, sociology or data or economics or geography or archaeology and so on. So he uses or photographs or other such visual evidence which he may have. He uses film as a basically as a kind of tool to illuminate the point which he makes in his classroom or in his books and so on and so forth. Two, the historian can see the film as representative of an ideological position. So here, of course, if you you look at, let's say, from the feminist perspective, it films emerge as representatives of the male gaze. From the political perspective, films emerge as hegemonic, as symbols, as commodities which promote cultural, social, and political hegemony of the ruling classes. Films may be openly, subtly, or crassly nationalist, or films could be counter hegemonic, as in the new wave parallel cinema or the cinema of neorealism, which began to gain ground after the end of fascist cinema in 1945. So you have the resurgence of realistic cinema from the late 40s, early 50s onwards, and of course you have Indian filmmakers who fall into this category. For those realistic filmmakers would people like Mrinal Sen or people like Satyajit Ray and so on and so forth, who began to make, who departed from the fantasy of Bollywood, consciously took a decision to prepare to make films which reflected the realities of the countries to which they belonged. Three, the historian can see film as a source of inspiration for more historical research. This, of course, I always tell my students to watch films because films are a stimulation. If you take a good documentary, or if you take a good feature film also, or if you take a good biopic, or anything which looks at a very important, let's say, debate or a historical event or a historical controversy which happened, let's say, 40 years, 50 years ago, and you have good newspaper coverage covered in the film, and you have footage of people being interviewed then and people being interviewed now and so on and so forth. You really have, for the young students and even for the older students like me, you really have a very good point of entry into more historical research on that topic. So if you, let's say, if you're an avid watcher of Netflix series, there are so many series which can actually make you read more about those events. You can go on to read books about those events. You can actually develop a very good perspective on the basis of the research which you carry out into these topics after being stimulated by films. And I mean, one can go on and on about how stimulating some films can be, or how stimulating some films are. So students, for instance, students who are doing their BA or MA, who have not been really taught the history of imperialism or colonialism, or students who have not been taught military history or the history of technology or the history of commodities like, let's say, sugar, honey, or alcohol, and so on and so forth. If they really want to do good economic history or they want to do good cultural history, many of these films are available for them. And if they are made to watch these films, the more curious amongst those students can end up doing a fair amount of good research on the basis of documentary work which they'll do, which they can then supplement with more films on these things, because these films then depend on a lot of footage which is available to the filmmaker, which of course can become part of the overall research projects which the students might undertake. Even in schools, this kind of, the film can be used as a very important stimulant to and an important entry point into research. So here the historian is attentive to the sensitive nature of film, because film conveys emotion like few books do. So all those who are interested in looking at the history of emotions, let's say history of childhood, or history of male female relationships, or history of how some people might have felt at a particular given time in history. Cinema becomes a very important source or an entry point into that sort of study. For the historian can turn. Now, this is when the film historian, can actually become a an amateur filmmaker. He can turn filmmaker and produce a unique way of narrating the past through biography and edited film. It's like, I mean, one can go back to what Hayden White said in the 70s when he talked about using photographs as a way of narrating the past. And he used a particular term called historiophoti, not historiography. Of course, there is nothing called, you cannot really narrate the past only with the help of photos, because all photos will have captions, and all photos strung together in a story will have a, you'll either they'll have a voiceover or they'll have a narrative which will put these photos in perspective for people to see them and make sense of them, and understand a sense of the past through these photographs. But then, like White says, if photos can be used mm, by historians, if photo albums of families, or let's say photographs of events, or photographs of leaders, or photographs of anything, because you have the photographic archive, especially of the 20th century, is an immense archive which I think historians have barely scratched. There's a great amount of material which keeps surfacing about things which we don't know, and surprising us about the ways in which the past might have occurred. Similarly, the historian can himself, he can use his sensibilities, and from his own perspective he can produce amateur films. Nowadays, this is not difficult to do because you have excellent cell phones, you have excellent small cameras which you can use and produce films about urban history or the history of the environment, or and so on and so forth, and all those things. So, to sum this point up, to the historian, the film can never be simple entertainment. It's like a, when you become a historian, it's like you're, it's like you're cursed, because you never look at it, never look at anything without the historical perspective. It's like becoming politicized about everything. It's like looking at culture, it's like looking at society, it's like looking at even entertainment as a political statement. So you become, see, it's like it's the curse of being critical. So you really, it's very difficult for you to even enjoy simple entertainment, simply because nothing like simple entertainment then remains in front of you. It's like another film becomes like another narrative or document which requires careful reading, analysis, criticism, and review. How does it revise a historian's perspective on the key issues of his subject? That becomes a very important question. Now, does it deepen the understanding of historical events, causation, and process which forms the core of history as a subject? Should historians watch films to begin with? Historians remain divided in their approach to films, but I find that I feel that the time has come for Indian historians, especially, to take films, and not only historical films but all films, very, very seriously. So now from here I go on to two things. First, I look at the historian as a historian and the feature film, and after that I'll look at the historian and the historical film. There are two positions. There are two kinds of films. Basically, you have the feature film and you have the historical film. Most films will fall into these two categories. Of course, uh, the orthodox historian tends to dismiss the feature film, also called commercial cinema, as fantasy with little or no historical value. This is a very old-fashioned, a rather untenable view nowadays. Nonetheless, social and cultural historians take mythology, epics, folklore, and legends seriously in their analysis of mentalities. So, the study of mentalities is crucial to histories focused on examining social change. I read somewhere something which the historian J.H. Plum very aptly put. He said it is not simply important for a historian to narrate the facts of a particular historical period. It is extremely important for the historian to delve into how people thought and how those thoughts of people changed over time. Now, that very few historians can actually do. Literatures sometimes I feel are better equipped to do these things. And if good literature is converted into cinema, then cinema can be a very important medium for our understanding social change, especially both the dialectics of continuity and social change can be understood by good cinema in many ways. So if you look at, if you look at Satyajit Ray's films, or you look at Mrinal Sen's films, or you look at films like, let's say, you look at Bimal Roy's films. If you have a film, or MS Satyu's, let's say you look at MS Satyu's Garam Hava, you suddenly realize that a very historically grounded world, social and cultural world of the partition actually opens in front of you. Similarly, if you look at Do Bigha Zameen, you probably you'll understand the current farmers agitation in a new light altogether. So films can also make you focus on contemporary events in a different way. They can actually historically foreground those events in front of you. So there are many ways in which social change and continuity can be narrated in cinema. Since there are no bare facts in history, the historian is left with no choice but to take all cultural expression in society seriously. In this, he is helped by the sociologist and the psychologist. As I'll sum up later on, uh, viewing cinema is itself a an interdisciplinary exercise in which the historian is subconsciously in touch, in interaction with geography, interaction with the environment, interaction with geology, interaction with water, seas, rivers, and so on and so forth. And he is, of course, in interaction, in a subconscious interaction with sociologists and the psychologists to understand how the characters in a particular film are built up, and whether and if he can identify such characters in his life, he can identify such characters in society, then really he's looking at, he's actually looking at social history which is happening on the screen. One can, of course, go on and on about, as a film buff and as a person interested in feature films and all sorts of cinema, one can go on and on about these things. But it's extremely important to see the film as a context of social history. So, 2 points: the historian can, and in my view, must study cinema for being representative of its time. So, why was Rajesh Khanna an important, popular star? Why did he become such a big star from the late 60s to the early 70s? What did he represent? Or why did the Angry Young Man films starring Amitabh Bachchan in the 70s succeed? Or why has Devdas as a tragic theme been loved by Indian audiences since the 1950s? In some, what do people prefer, and why do they remain important? I mean, and these questions remain important to the cultural historian. In this way, a typical Hindi film can be seen as representative of dominant patriarchal values in society. Is that why Indian audiences continue to lap up these dominant patriarchal values conveyed to them as a reaffirmation of their own lives and their own beliefs through feature films? And that's where we actually see how, that's where we must note how Satyajit Ray called the Indian audiences extremely backward. The fact that excellent movies don't often succeed at the box office, because these movies challenge the uh, audiences. I mean, movies which challenge the audiences are different from movies which reaffirm the culture of the audiences. If audiences love films which reaffirm their culture, which reaffirm the identities with which people have grown up, have become habitual since their childhood, then what is it about these films? What do they convey? The meanings. That's very important for a historian to understand. I mean, it's like saying, I mean, why do certain kinds of novels sell in their millions, for instance? Or, let's say, if why is it that Why is it that in smaller towns or even in bigger cities, certain authors sell millions of copies of their novels? And these novels, maybe, there was a time when Gulshan Nanda novels used to really, they used to sell like anything. Manoj pocket books, for instance, I'm sure some of them were, some of the pocket books themselves narrated stories the way films would narrate stories on the screen. Manoj pocket books did very well. Why is it that these things are important? What sort of what kind of world do these people, what do these novels actually make their readers enter into, and how do they comfort those readers? So are these comfort films? Are feature films comfort films? If feature films can be seen as comfort films, what is it in the feature film which actually comforts the audiences and makes for their lasting popularity? So these are extremely important questions which the film historian has to answer. The second way in which the feature film can be seen by the historian is to see feature films as films which contain incidental evidence of the times in which they are made. Now, if historians can access, as Pierre Sorlin says, but it's very difficult for historians to access the unedited film, they might come across interesting historical evidence, and this makes the film an archive open to extrapolation. Films shot both indoors and outdoors contain a fair deal of incidental evidence of fixtures, of furniture, fashion, architecture, town planning, forests, lakes. I mean, you can actually, let's say, you if you want to see, if you want to say, I mean, if you want to see, let's say, the Naini Lake, you want to see the Lake of Nainital in Hindi movies, and you start looking at films, let's say, from 1950s, 60s till the contemporary times, which have used, let's say, the Lake of Nainital as a. I'm just giving you an example. Lake, let's say, the Nainital Lake as a backdrop, as an outdoor backdrop for outdoor shooting of film songs or sequences and so on. You can actually, you can actually you can actually prepare a short visual history of the historical transformation of this lake and its surroundings from the 1950s till date. Similarly, uh, let's say you can actually use films of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on to actually narrate, make a narrative, actually write a narrative account, an analytical account, of course, with the help of architects and designers who are more aware of these things than historians are, about the kind of buildings which there were, buildings which were there in the cities of India, what kind of roads were there, what sort of cars were there, and what kind of traffic was there. Were the cities as crowded as they are today? Were they cleaner than how they are today? What was the condition of the garbage in the cities before plastic? Were there as many animals on the streets even in those days as there are today? So these are things, toys, food, celebrations. How were the birthday parties celebrated, let's say in the 60s and 70s? How were they celebrated in the 80s and 90s? What changes happened in the way people's culture was actually shown by filmmakers? Weapons, tools, and so on. So, therefore, the feature film remains important to the cultural and social historian, in two main ways: film as mentality and film as incidental evidence. Then, of course, you have the historian and the historical film, where you have the usual questions. All film per se is historical because all film narrates a story, and all film talks about the past in some way or the other. It may be a personal past. It may be the past of a. It may be the past of a, past or present of a couple which goes to college not to study but to fall in love and sit in the canteen and crack jokes and basically sing songs around trees, or indulge in violent activities, whatever. So all films are historical films in that sense. The period historical and the documentary command a special place in the film historian's field of study. What should his approach to these be? Now, after asking the questions mentioned in the triangulation model, which I have referred to earlier, the historian is left with the following questions questions which must be answered in the process of his watching and digesting the historical film. One, is the film accurate in terms of events? Can its imagery be reconciled with a credible interpretation of facts? These are, of course, questions which you ask of your historical evidence and sources in any case. What is the interpretation of facts offered by the film? Is it one sided, or does it provide a quote unquote balanced view, which it's usually very difficult to provide? What kind of text is the film based on? Is it myth or an authentic historical narrative which can be verified? Is the film nationalist, fascist, socialist in orientation? Is it feminist in orientation? Who is the filmmaker? Is the film propaganda or critique? These are questions which have been asked earlier. In the case of documentary films or serialized documentaries which are available on, let's say, Amazon Prime or the Netflix platforms or television platforms today, what are the sources of the filmmaker? Let's say if somebody is making a film on, let's say somebody is remaking the Ramayana or somebody is remaking the Mahabharata, which particular text of the Mahabharata or Ramayana is he using? If, let's say, if somebody wants to make a film on Napoleon, uh, which biography of Napoleon is the film being made? If somebody is making a film on, let's say, Bajirao Mastani, what texts are being used to make those film, and what actually, what kind of a bias or prejudice does come into the film as a consequence of the texts chosen upon which the film is made? Why is the documentary made? What testimony informs it? How is the oral history of the respondents used in the documentary? Does it use interjections by historians and experts periodically to illuminate certain points in the documentary? Does it use techniques of juxtaposition in time, putting screens together and showing people the difference between places and people? Is the documentary informed by critical history, political economy, statistics, psychology, authentic footage, and so on and so forth? Does the documentary or documentaries on a single subject inspire the historian to read and research more? Here, coming back to the older point about film being a point from where you enter a more exciting world of political economy or cultural history or history of habits, commodities, and so on and so forth, history of piracy, history of the navy or military history, history of military technology. These are things which actually interest people. So if you have, let's say, if you have a very good feature film on Stalingrad, and then you correlate that film with documentaries on Stalingrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, and then you read Anthony Beevor's, let's say, beautiful book on the Battle of Stalingrad, or you read other books, Soviet books on the Battle of Stalingrad, then you can actually develop a holistic, critical understanding of not only military history but a particularly important battle of the Second World War. So you have to watch lots of films, lots of documentaries, and read books at the same time to be able to understand, to be able to develop a holistic understanding of particular events. So, can documentaries document true popular life? Because history is not only about events and great men. How is popular life going to be documented? Let's say you want to document the life of the working classes, or you want to document the life of poor women, working women, or maids, or or your gardeners, and so on and so forth. How do you do it? Because that is also history. History is not only about writing biopics of great men and talking about what they did in history and so on and so forth. So the kind of history you want to do, your choice of cinema also depends upon that kind of history. So basically, to conclude, I think I'm coming to the end of the allotted hour, the allotted hour given to me to speak on this very interesting topic, on which one could actually have excluded a large number of footage and so on, large amount of footage. Ideally, I would have wanted to show you clippings from films and documentaries and so on to actually illustrate some of the points which I have made, which probably I'll do in the course of time for a much larger presentation on this on some other platform. But let's say, to conclude, if you look at Justin Smith's, if you look at Smith's way of Smith's three ways of understanding film, and these three ways of understanding film have evolved since the early 20th century. A, understanding films with reference to theories which we use to understand society and history in general. And these are, of course, theories such as Marxism, feminism, structuralism, post structuralism, psychoanalysis, and I mean, there are, these are the theories which, by and large, inform the way artists, filmmakers, writers, historians have worked in the 20th century. And no social science has been done, no meaningful social science has been done without reference to these theoretical perspectives. So, number one, whenever you see a film, you refer to a particular theory, and you use that theory to understand, to actually to create a paradigm within which you understand that cinema, and you also critique it at the same time. So psychoanalysis plays a very, very important role. Freudian psychoanalysis began to play a very important role in the understanding of cinema, especially after the Second World War. And some of the analyses of Hindi films have been done from a deeply psychoanalytic, Freudian perspective. And Parasha's work on Hindi cinema, for instance, in which she has called Hindi cinema, especially Hindi feature films, essentially as phallocentric films. Uh, are and she's used the entire vocabulary and entire conceptual all the conceptual categories created by Freud, things like Oedipal complex and so on and so forth, to understand the relationships, intra family relationships, which are actually displayed on the screen by the social Indian social film, the feature film. It's a very interesting analysis. If you people can look up Parasha's work on Hindi cinema, and the impact of even Freudian psychoanalysis on the understanding of film. So that's only one way. Of course, you have Marxism and feminism. Of course, feminism has played a very important role in deconstructing cinema as male gaze, the camera as a voyeur, as basically a camera as an instrument of male voyeurism. And this is not merely with respect to porn and other films which actually commodify women, but this is with respect to films which you and me might consider, very normal and normal entertainment, and so on and so forth. B, understanding film via literary and cultural studies approaches. In these approaches, films are analyzed as a genre, particular type of films, the crime genre, the political documentary, humor, period historical, Holocaust films, war films, or films understood as auteur films. So famous and popular film directors, let's say Satyajit Ray or Mrinal Sen or Bimal Roy or Gurudat, or Sham Benegal for that matter, or Govind Nihalani in India, or it could be Francis Ford Coppola, or you could be Bernardo Bertolucci, it could be Martin Scorsese, or other famous directors who are known for producing certain. These are the auteur filmmakers, and these are the auteurs, the famous and famous popular film directors who make particular kinds of. They're famous for making particular kinds of movies. So you understand them like this. They You use the theories of literary criticism and cultural studies, and start looking at these films from that perspective, reading films as if they were documents, which talk about society, which is being filmed in those films. See film as history or simply film history. And this perspective belongs to the 1930s, when the pioneering works of film historians Paul Rotha and Francis Conceit charted the dualism of the film history discipline. And this dualism basically comprises of what I have spoken, what I have said earlier in this short, rather inadequate presentation. One, the history of cinema, or cinemas, if you prefer. Uh, Cinema as a different mode of social and emotional history. You do here. You don't look at cinema as primarily as a source of history. You look at cinema as a different way of doing history. It's like understanding folklore. It's like understanding legend, or it's like understanding the epic as a way of narrating the past. So here, cinema becomes a special mode in which knowledge is conveyed, knowledge about the past, about history, social, cultural, political, or architectural, or whatever history is conveyed to the audiences. This is important because emotions and facts both are important to our study of the past. So even if you don't accord facticity to cinema, it is the emotional quotient of the film which remains very important. And if this emotion has found popularity in the past, the job of the historian is to investigate why people have liked a certain kind of emotional cinema, a certain kind of emotional appeal of a particular kind of cinema. And finally, of course, this is a question, this is a particular thing with which most historians are very happy, because sources remain central to the writing and conceptualization of history as a discipline. All historians are overjoyed to, whenever there's talk of sources, it brings a smile to the face of the historians. They feel more comfortable with themselves because that is the way their discipline has grown since the 19th century. There is no historian without sources, and there is no history without sources, and there are no sources without their historians. So, looking at film as a source of history. Again, this goes back to what I have said earlier. I'm only summing up things here. Films as traces of the past, traces of the past as they are found in documents, as they are found in archaeology, as they are found in cave paintings, or as they are found in geographical evidence or epigraphical evidence or other kinds of evidence. Similarly, there are traces of the past found in films, in which the film itself becomes, or a number of films become an archive for the historian, and these include, of course, feature films, which I accord a great status in my understanding of cinema. I think one should not ignore feature films, which contain a great deal of incidental evidence regarding the past, and of course, the film as an expression of what people prefer to see and enjoy in the past. So you really have a variety of perspectives available to the historians to be able to see, enjoy, and understand cinema. And I hope my brief presentation has done justice to some of them. And I have concluded by referring to these three or four points about a possible method which we may evolve in this country, in our university departments and outside, to be able to make sense of this wonderful medium of narrating the past, present, and future. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely. I completely agree with you, sir. I mean, I've often thought about how historical films actually offer us a privileged, it's a privileged medium for not just the scholars of cinema and media, but also history. And how, like, the way cinema engages with the past, whether it's recent or distant, as something as Padmavat or something, and how it provides us a case, like very interesting case studies of how generations of people renegotiate cultural memory, and how they understand how the past is shaping the present. So it's very important that we do this. We have a number of questions, and I'm so happy that we were able to bring this up. Um, I've often talked to some of my students about, um, after studying history, working as film directors. And I was researching once and I realized a lot of film directors actually end up having, whether they are making social films or any kinds of films, not just the directors who are known for making period films. A lot of directors have great, deep interest in history. So, which speaks a lot about, some students of history having a career and a possibility in taking this up. for future. So there is a question by Ali Haider. The question is, sir, if anybody asks you that what are your favorite unbiased historical movies that you suggest as a model to be followed for making historical movies, then which films will you suggest to watch? I'm sure you knew this question was coming.
Well, this is always a
Which
question asked by. I mean, this is a it's a very popular question also, and I think we all have to seek our particular individual answers to these questions. If Haider Sahab actually, he interacts with me on another medium, and maybe we can have a more productive dialogue about what he's raised. So there is no
why
unbiased
not on this
historical.
medium? What's stopping us?
No, what I'm trying to say is, you see, there's nothing called an unbiased historical movie. The question is whether the bias is correct or not. So there's
Hmm.
nothing called unbiased historical. I mean, there's nothing called biased. I mean, this whole notion that there can be an objective truth somewhere in the past, I think it's a notion which has to be jettisoned, and it is a notion which does not, it does not hold, actually it was given up by historians across the world 40 years ago. So we don't really talk about unbiased. The question
Hmm.
is, the question which you have to ask yourself is whether if you like a particular kind of uh, historical film, why do you like that film?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
does that particular film do justice to the overall truth of the matter which it is trying to narrate? So
Hmm.
I think if you let's say if you let me give you a small example. For instance, let's say you want to watch a film on Cuba, for instance. You'd like to know the history of Cuba,
Right.
and you want to watch a movie on Cuba. Or let's say you want to know the history of the sugarcane plantations in South America. There are many documentaries on that, and you have a great documentary on sugar in the story. I mean, you have these series of documentaries on commodities, like let's say sugar or honey, or asparagus, and or things, avocados, and so on and so forth, and all these food fads which keep coming up in front of us. When you
Hmm.
watch such movies, it is for you to then go ahead and do a bit more of research to find out whether those documentaries are actually narrating a kind of, a true account of what happened in the past,
Hmm.
not facticity. It is the approximation of truth which is more important.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
I mean, does the film address a range of theories in its ability to narrate a story of the past? Let's
Hmm.
say you really want to know, you really want to see, let's say you want to see the story of, I mean, recently I watched the 66 episode history of, this, the great, the great liberator of South America from Spanish rule. Uh, that great leader. For instance, you have, uh, and if you look at that, if you look at those 66 episodes, for instance, it's about Simon Bolivar, for instance, and you have not only one, you have a Netflix. Series. You have a Netflix series on Simon Bolivar, and you have, let's say, a Colombian TV network called Caracol TV, which has also done a number of episodes on Simon Bolivar. So altogether,
Hmm.
you've got 66 episodes. It's a mammoth. It's a very big program on a man who is revered in South America as the liberator. Perhaps one of the
Hmm.
greatest generals of history. We talk about Genghis Khan. We talk about Alexander, but nobody talks about Simon. If you look at Simon Bolivar's career, he's a much bigger general. Much bigger horseman, much bigger general than Genghis Khan and and Alexander put together. I mean, the number of hours he spent on horseback
Battlefield.
would actually is
Hmm.
probably more than many generals and many rulers put together throughout their lives. And Simon Bolivar died very early. He was not even 50 when he died. He had a life. I
That's
mean,
great.
he suffered from and now you see he is the one who played a very important role as the person who led the liberation movement, which
Hmm.
decolonized South America in the 19th century and liberated South America and created the basis of the modern South American state
Hmm.
system from Spanish rule. So you must, after you've seen this, you must go to the books and see whether these series are actually true to the facts of Simon Bolin. Are they narrating a true story? The question is not of details. I mean, you a character may be created here or a character may be created there that you also create. I mean, I'm sure a historian writing about medieval India might create a couple of characters. I mean, a couple of characters may have been created by Abul Fazal or somebody who who wrote about his experiences, and these characters then come and start playing an important role in your own narrative and so on and so forth. Those things keep happening. The bigger question which I am addressing to Ali Haider Sahab is, you have to yourself go and study and research and judge uh, the amount of bias in a historical film. And despite that bias, if that film is worth watching, and whether that film itself encourages you to investigate that bias.
Hmm.
So you can read and find out. There is no harm in being biased. The question is to confront your own bias. That is more
Hmm.
important. No, I think this whole notion that there is some objective history out there which needs to be rescued from bias or from interpretation, that notion is a very old-fashioned notion, and it doesn't hold true nowadays. There are interpretations, and without interpretations, there is no history. Some interpretations are more credible than other interpretations simply because
Right.
they are done by honest people, they are done by honest researchers whose motives are politically far better and far clearer than the motives of mischief makers who want to falsify history and use and abuse history for their political purposes. That much you should be able to understand.
So
I
I
think
think the
Haider
next
Saab,
question by Mirza Hasnain is sort of related. Don't you think that documentary is better graphical source for historian than movies? Can you suggest some great documentaries based on history? So this is very similar, and I think you did mention about Simon Bolivar. So I believe that's a series of
That's
documentaries.
one. Then one series which you can watch. I mean, I think it's a series which you relish. And then you read Gabriel Garcia Marquez's last novel, The General in His Labyrinth. I mean, Marquez is one of my favorite authors, and Marquez is a deeply historical. His thinking is deeply historical. So,
Absolutely.
so if you read the Latin American authors like Marquez or Maria Vargas Llosa or Isabel Allende, you really realize that how deeply historical and how deeply anti-colonial their thought is. Which is very difficult. I mean, that kind of writing is very difficult, very different from the kind of writing which you find in many other parts of the world. Similarly, with the African writers, for instance, they are deeply anti-racist, they are deeply anti-colonial, and they are far less influenced by their colonial masters and their languages than the writers in this part of the world are. And of course, I may be wrong, but that is what my reading usually leads me to believe. There are good documentaries and there are bad documentaries. Similarly, there are good movies and there are bad movies.
Right.
So, if you want me to suggest good documentaries in India, I think you can watch. I mean, there are some very good documentaries which have been produced in the last 20, 30 years. I think one very good documentary filmmaker in India is Anand Patwardhan, who makes excellent
Hmm.
documentaries based on genuine footage and authentic information, and who's very critical and very sensitive. So maybe if you Ram Ke Naam, if you want to watch that, or similarly at that around the same time you had Kamal Hassan produced that book, make that film Hey Ram. You can watch that. That's a good film. It's part documentary, part feature film. So there are many such films. You have Rakesh Sharma's Final Solution. Of course, the title is borrowed from the genocidal plans of the Nazis regarding the destruction of the Jews in the concentration camps. But there are two or three documentaries which I have recently watched, which are very good. There's one documentary which I keep watching, which I think is excellent. It is by Claude De Lundsman, who was a French documentary maker who made it in the 1970s. It is considered one of the biggest and greatest documentaries ever made on the Holocaust. And this is Shoah, which basically in Hebrew means
Beautiful.
the great destruction. and it's an 8 hour long
Yes.
documentary. And remarkably, the documentary shows there is no footage of Auschwitz or Auschwitz, Birkenau, or the concentration camps in this documentary. It's just with the help of interviews, with the information provided by historians like Royal Hilberg and other people who have a great who have a great knowledge of how the Nazi system used to work. It's by meeting common people, meeting those people who had been rehabilitated in large numbers in West Germany. It's by gradually, the story of the Holocaust unfolds as an event which happened not merely because some leaders wanted it to happen. It happened because of a certain civilizational malaise which had crept into European civilization, especially German, Polish, East European, and French
Hmm.
civilizations, as a consequence of cultural and educational anti-Semitism, which developed over 300-400 years and was cultivated by the Christian rulers of these countries. So that's one documentary. Another one I think is the Soranos documentary, The Hour of the Furnaces. In three parts, narrates the entire history. Soranos was the person who actually coined the term third cinema, which he said this is not auteur cinema, this is not Hollywood. This is third cinema. Third cinema is about the cinema of struggling people. Third cinema is the cinema about the oppressed. Third cinema is the cinema about the struggles against imperialism, colonialism. It's a cinema which documents the history, lives, and struggles of the working people of the world. That's the third cinema. It's a cinema about women, struggling women who do not want to become victims anymore, who want to become agents in history. So Sorano's a three-part magnum documentary, Hour of the Furnaces, I think, is an excellent documentary in which you can actually see a very condensed, well-informed history of imperialism, colonialism, neo-colonialism, and the possible ways out of this conundrum in the context of Argentine history. So these are very good documentaries, and I mean, of course, if you look up Netflix, there are so many documentaries. Recently, I saw a documentary
Right.
about the thalidomide children, which features Harold Evans, who died,
Hmm.
recently. Not in and Harold Evans was one of the best journalists of the uh, post-war period, and how much work he did for the thalidomide children. And you have young Harold Evans, and you have the older Harold Evans, who's constantly talking in this documentary. And this is about, how this is about the pharma companies, for instance, or you have the documentaries of Michael Moore, for instance, which are very critical and very well informed. So the documentary genre, which is done very critically, which is based on authentic footage, which is based on facts, which is done on reading and research, is a very, very good way of approaching the past and learning history and teaching history to the students. Only, of course, if the powers that be allow you to do that. I saw Anil
Right.
Joshi's
So
name
in the
on.
same,
Yeah.
yes, in the same, same strand, I think we were talking about Bombay films. So why are the most period films from Bombay film industry made on historical themes? They're so ahistorical. Once, when I put this question to certain prominent filmmakers like Sham Benegal and Govind Nilhani, the answer I got was, "We are making films as entertainment and not as historical documentary." Your comment here.
Well, I mean, Govind Nihalani has, I mean, he's not really a historical filmmaker, but he makes social films which are historically very relevant. I don't think he made Akrosh for entertainment alone. So he's doing injustice to his own. If he said that to Nadeem, then he actually did an injustice to his own craft. Sham Benegal has made a few historical movies, which apparently didn't do very well at the box office. So, I mean, but this is the usual question, usual answer which you get, because they know that Indian audiences are historically ill-informed. They're very emotional, and they are driven by prejudices and biases. And these prejudices are extremely important to reproduce these prejudices and ultra nationalist and nationalist histories, which are loved by audiences, as Ray says in one of his interviews, are extremely who are reactionary and who are extremely psychologically backward, and whoever uh, who basically become mobs very quickly. So these are the sort of people you can't really trust good history to these sorts of people who are not going to appreciate that in any case. And of course, then if you're in Bollywood, money becomes very very important. And what better
Right.
way to make money than convert legend into history and then just write a disclaimer saying that this is based on legend, not on history, and then let loose on the mobs who come out screaming and baying for blood and for revenge and so on and so forth. And then some fringe outfit making the film quite successful after getting it a temporary ban on it and so on. These are all games and dramas which they keep playing. Bollywood is, I
Absolutely.
mean, I would never trust Bollywood with a good historical theme because they make a kachara out of everything which they produce.
And
It's a very
also
regressive, it's a very regressive film industry, and it promotes all sorts of reactionary and backward values. And these films are loved by the audiences because the audiences are themselves, I mean, it's a mutual reinforcement of reactionary prejudiced views of women and of college going people and of outliers in society and so on and so forth. And that's
so
why
you've
films get
answered
banned.
Professor Elizabeth's
That's why,
question.
and I'm also going to say to Nadeem that let's not pretend that India has a civil society, because, as Ambedkar said many decades ago, India really doesn't have a. You don't really have a civil society in the same way as France had one, or the UK had one, and so on. So let's stop pretending that we are in a very liberal civil kind of space.
Okay, on that note, I'm going to ask you a lighter question that Ms. Jaffer is asking. What is your
Hmm.
opinion of a film like Mughal Azam? It's a cult
It's a
classic,
period.
but
It's
historically,
a doesn't see the these words don't matter at all to his. See, being a classic or beautiful film or lovely film or vibrant, these are words which have this vocabulary does not matter at all to the historian. Let me tell you very clearly.
right.
Mughal Azam age is based on myths. I mean, it creates and recreates the myth of Anarkali and Salim. You historians of medieval India know. We don't even know whether such a woman existed. We don't know whether this love affair itself was manufactured. I remember Amin Saab, Shahid's father, who taught me in college. He once said, "अरे भाई अनिरुद्ध, ये तो अकबर को जब ये पता चला कि ये सलीम जो है अनपॉपुलर हैं और ये जो है आवाम इनको बहुत ज्यादा पसंद नहीं करती, तो उन्होंने ये खुद ही इस किस्म की एक कहानी बना दी इनके बारे में, ताकि जो है लोगों को इनसे सिंपैथी पैदा हो जाए।" लेकिन आम आदमी को क्या लगता है? आम आदमी को वो ये पद्मावती की कहानियां और ये सलीम की कहानियां और ये सब जो है ये सब मिथोलॉजीज आम आदमी को ये कहानियां पसंद हैं। It's a nation making film. It's a secular film in the sense it promotes it. I mean, if you see the voiceover in the beginning of the film, the map of India and all that, so it's a very Nehruvian.
Mm,
It's a Nehruvian. It's a
okay.
Nehruvian Ganga Jamuni kind of sort of film, which may have its historical value and so on. But as a historical film, I don't think uh, I don't think it's a very
Okay, so I think
it's
there's
it's
a
an
problem
emotional
with, huh,
it's an emotional drama between a son and father. It's like a typical son and father problem. Let's say Rustam Saurabh, or any other it's like a historical
right.
replay of Turgenev or whatever. So what I'm trying to say is that and of course it created myths which have become very good for tourist guides and so on after that, because people want to go and see Jodhabai's Mahal in Fatehpur Sikri, but there was nobody called Jodhabai, as Nadim knows
Hmm.
very well. There was only a Rajput queen. Her name was, we don't know whether her name was Jodhabai. We don't know. We have no idea. So it created, I mean, it created an image of Akbar also. Prithviraj Kapoor became that image, that fat, big man, who was portrayed as Akbar, and with his heaving voice and so on, and so on. So I mean, it's a period historical. Come on, I mean, it's a period historical, and Indians don't read normally. Indians have very bad reading habits. Most Indians don't read anything beyond their WhatsApp forwards and so on, which is full of fake news in any case. So it was in those days. Even in those days, people never read anything. They used to read these, I mean, two penny novels and so on, in which all sorts of myths used to be produced. So I mean,
Right.
it was a feel good film, and that's all.
It's a
You could
great
go to
love story.
You could go to Fatehpur Sikri and ask your tourist guide. He will show you Jodhabai's Mahal, and he will also show you the Tehkhana from where a tunnel is supposed to go to Agra Fort, which is all basically bakwas. I mean, there is no tunnel which goes to Agra Fort from there.
I think at some point, maybe one should talk about maybe here on this platform about how popular period films have corroded or impacted our understanding and built our perception. Here is my favorite question by Anil Joshi. And Anil Joshi asks, um, what's your take on Bhojpuri films? I'm very curious because I love this question. How far are they, and how far have they been successful in portraying the Bihari and the Eastern UP identity? So let's talk about this.
Number one, is there a Bihari and Eastern identity? That is the first question which I'd like to ask Anil Joshi. Or is it an identity
Yeah.
we have foisted? Is it an identity we have foisted on them by being quote unquote non-Purbiya? I mean, frankly speaking, I am not a great expert on Bhojpuri films, and I think I have seen a few of them. One of them was Ganga Maiya Tohre Peri Chadaivo, which I think Anil Joshi likes very much. And you had these Bhojpuri films in which you had Sujit Kumar and people like Sudhir and other people. Sudhir, of course, he was a Punjabi, he was not a Bhojpuri fellow. Sujit Kumar, of
Hmm.
course, used to be called the Dilip Kumar or of Bhojpuri movies. But I think they also stereotype their own culture, and they also, I mean, they sometimes many of these films become smaller stereotypes of Hindi movies, and so on. Like South Indian movies are taken and made into Hindi movies and vice versa, and so on. But of course, Anil is a fellow traveler. He loves movies like I do, and he's it's always a pleasure to, and he has an encyclopedic mind when it comes to Hindi cinema and film directors and songs and so on and so forth. And we keep sharing our notes on the Facebook and otherwise. And I think he would be, and he's in a much better position to answer this question himself. So maybe he can come on this screen and speak a little about it. But I am a little,
In fact,
I profess a large degree of ignorance about the Bhojpuri films.
I've had the opportunity of interviewing Ravi Kishan, and I think there is a lot to be said there. In fact, how Bhojpuri cinema has taken hold, and as you said, we can ask Mr. Joshi himself. So, they're very
Yeah, I'm sure.
popular
I'm
in.
sure. No, no, I'm sure. No, I'm sure it satisfied. It satisfies a certain identitarian need of the
Yes,
Purbiya in a non-Purbiya surrounding. So it makes it.
right.
It's like the Hindi movies, which the NRI sort of movies, the crossover movies, which do well abroad because there is this craving for seeing something which makes them feel important and relevant. Because frankly speaking, nobody gives a damn to Hindi movies abroad. I mean, in fact, India doesn't feature anywhere in the news reports abroad. If you stay, let's say, if you were to live in a country like Austria, and if you were to watch TV or look at newspapers there, most probably you would come to the conclusion that there is no country like India which exists because nobody really talks about India. Similarly, in the UK, India makes a very small piece of news on the 10th page or something. So, frankly speaking, it is this sense of self-importance, this sense of if you are a confused desi abroad, then it really makes a lot of sense for you to to identify with these Karan Johar kind of silly movies in which people do all sorts of things. People do things in New York which they can very well do in Bombay or in Delhi, but I don't know why they should go to New York to fall ill and die there, but they can easily fall ill and die here. But it's all very romantic and very glorified to go and get treated there, and basically like that silly
It's
Kal Ho Na
possibly
Ho
also
film which she
easy to
made.
shoot there,
Mm.
and of course, it depends a
Yeah, it's
lot on the
probably
audience.
easier. It's less bureaucratic, and probably no group of hooligans or mobs will actually get to you, and suddenly a bunch of thugs will not appear on the uh, you know
But
on the
Bhojpuri cinema, I mean, just for the
mm,
viewers to know, I think what is very interesting is that the people who went to, let's say, Fiji, UK, or Mauritius, South
mm,
Africa, Trinidad and Tobago, the Netherlands even, as indentured
Mm,
laborers. Actually,
mm.
their descendants, Bhojpuri cinema has made,
Yeah,
has made a huge impact.
yeah,
And
as I said, it's a question of identity. See, it's a question of identity. I mean,
yes,
but there is another kind of cinema. There's another kind of cinema which focuses on Bhojpur, but is not
hmm,
Bhojpuri cinema per se. Let's say if
hmm,
you look at let's say you look at a cinema called Apaharan, in which you had
hmm,
Deogan. Okay,
right,
it's a gangster film. Or if you have a
hmm,
film, let's say not in Bhojpur, something set in Dhanbad of the 1980s, which talks about the coal mafia, gangs of Wasepur, for instance. You know? Or if you look at an earlier film produced by Prakash Jha many years ago, it's a film called Damul, which was based on intercaste warfare in the Bhojpur regions, when there were the red armies were there were these leftist armies which were clashing with the Ranveer Sena, and those are senas were fighting with each other. So that's a different kind of. Or you have the Mountain Man, for instance, this Maji Mountain Man, in which you had you have that kind of background given to you. And these are films which focus on things like caste oppression, agrarian
hmm,
oppression, things. Or they focus on the realities of feudalism, caste feudalism, realities of oppression, of rape and of murder and of the violence being perpetrated on people. So when you look at those films, those are films about Bihar and parts of Bihar, which may be Bhojpur or other parts of Bihar for that matter, but they are not exactly, you cannot slot them into quote unquote Bhojpuri cinema per se, which gives you a certain kind of song and dance sequence and gives you a certain identity of the Bhojpuri, which a Bhojpuri person in Delhi might like to identify with, simply because he cannot access that cultural milieu here. He feels an outsider. So these are two different things altogether.
great. So we have absolutely no time, but I think we must take this one last question. Um, by Dr. Lakshmikant Mishra. He says, does cinema actually provide any source for writing history, as films themselves are based on historical or social incidents with lots of imagination? So I think you've touched upon this in
Yeah,
a
of
bunch
course. I
of.
mean, one other thing. I mean, I just want to focus on that word imagination. No historian works without imagination. All history, all written history is also, in one way or the other, imagined history. Otherwise, you would have no narrative. All narratives are products of the imagination of the past, which goes on in the historian's mind. The question is whether that imagined past does justice to the truth of the past or not. That is the question. Not to be afraid of imagination. ये जो नोशन आता है ना कि वो फैक्चुअल होना चाहिए, इमेज, आप फैक्ट्स क्या होते हैं, मतलब फैक्ट्स तो जब तक इंटरप्रिटेशन में नहीं होंगे, एक कहानी में नहीं होंगे, एक इमेजिनेशन में नहीं होंगे, उन फैक्ट्स का मतलब ही कुछ नहीं है। पास्ट तो है नहीं ना, यू कैन नॉट गो बैक इनटू अकबर्स टाइम्स और सिमोन बोलीवार्स टाइम्स, और यू कैन नॉट गो बैक इनटू पंडित नेहरूज टाइम्स। आई मीन यू, वो जब आप पास्ट रिक्रिएट करेंगे, जब उसके बारे में लिखेंगे, तो you will use literary language, you will use, as my one of my mentors in JNU, Professor Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, who died a few years ago, used to say to me in class, used to say, Anirudh, we should learn, historians should learn how to write learned prose. A history book should, I think, in my view, an authentic history book should read like a good piece of literature. In the same way as a good piece of literature should convey a very good sense of history. Similarly, a good economics book also should read like a piece of literature. I mean, why should it be dry, and why should it put off somebody who's interested in the subject? So this whole notion that lot of imagination, there is no history without a lot of imagination. There is no human being without imagination. The only thing which differentiates you from animals is not intelligence but imagination. And Einstein used to say that imagination is superior to intelligence. So I think an imaginative historian is a good historian. Let's not be afraid of that. Why should you feel scared of it? And the question has been answered in the presentation, I feel.
Indeed, indeed. All right. So, with that note, I think we should say thank you very, very much. And I feel like a lot of history students could actually take up careers as filmmakers, if not anything, possibly, as Professor Rizavi wants. Um, that the fact that our Indian films lack historical rigor as compared to the Western counterparts, maybe we could, after studying history, make a difference there.
No,
I thought
I'd
Lagan was badly researched. The costumes looked pretty decent, and
which
so
one?
did Lagan.
That's another, it's a fantasy.
It is a fantasy indeed.
It's
There
a
is no
fantasy.
historical basis to it, but I thought the costumes in Lagan
No,
were very well researched.
it's a nationalist film. Okay,
Hmm.
it showcases the nation. It even
Hmm.
includes a disabled person in that nation. Okay, so
Absolutely.
it's a nationalist narrative. It's not a historical film at all. I mean, and I find
Hmm.
some of the characterizations of the English in that film are a little overdone.
Yes.
When I saw that, I don't think it's a popular film because I mean, if people liked it because you were basically giving it back to the English, in your own way. But that's what Indians like to do, and justifiably so. Why not? Because they gave it to us for 250 years, so it's high time you gave it back to them a little. But it's
More
its
artistic
value.
manner,
The value of that film is basically it's a nationalist narrative. It's a
great feel good
it's a
film.
Bollywood nationalist narrative. A better film made by him was Tare Zameen Par, which I
Hmm.
think is
Hmm.
historically far more important to understand because our attitude towards disabled people or autistic children or that that showcasing of that attitude is far more historically, sociologically, culturally,
Important.
psychologically far more significant than that Lagan or whatever this
Agreed.
film they had made. This in which these guys go and they blow up a radio station or so. I don't know what Basanti, Rang De Basanti. That was a horrible film.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah,
it's,
of course.
it's the sort of film which encourages vigilante action and so on. That's fantasy basically. It's
It is
it's it's
indeed.
it's the sort of middle class vigilante action against a systemic problem which doesn't really work. I mean, in any case, middle class people don't go into real radio stations and do those things. They don't have the guts to do it. That's more of a fantasy. But I mean, this Tare Zameen Par, I think, was a much better. It's a much better film, and it has deeper historical value in our understanding of our society and its attitude towards a certain section of the marginalized people.
Hmm. Hmm. Great. So I think another session is much needed for this because we need to delve into the subgenres and the cultural implications and the revisions that one has to look at when studying a
So,
topic like this.
see, I'd rather that, I mean, as Nadeem said, instead of looking at Bollywood for careers because it's very difficult to find careers for honest, good people in Bollywood, which is like any other industry. It has nepotism and all sorts of problems and so on. Instead of looking at Bollywood as career opportunities, I feel our young students, especially those who are doing, universities should offer more film history, cinema history courses, which they don't do. There should be more practical seminars on cinema and history, of course, with a lot of reading and you have to read. It's not easy because reading sociology is not easy. Reading psychology is not easy. These are very tough things to read. It's not, and it'll also help them read sources in a different way altogether. You really get into the psyche of the person who actually produces a particular kind of historical source. A historical no source is not, it's a human being which has produced that source. So you can't really understand that source unless you go behind that source and try to understand the mentality of the human being who has produced that source. So this will actually equip our students to understand social, cultural, and intellectual history in a better way, in a more competent way than reading dry histories of these pasts, which they keep reproducing in their unoriginal MPhils and PhDs. So and they can become amateur filmmakers. I think amateur filmmaking has a great it has a great future as an independent an independent initiative taken by students, because they can bring their sensibility as a historian
Yes.
into their cell phones, which they can use, let's say, to document migrant laborers or working classes or their own domestic helps or animals or environment or whatever. I mean, lots of things too. You have to be careful because filming can be quite unsafe in some places. So mind that. So but they
Okay,
can do
so
that.
one last
Um,
question, even though we have very, like, literally no time. I would like to know your take on war drama like Hakikat, because you have written a lot on this topic. So
it's a
maybe.
national. It's a nationalist film, and it's a film which talks about a battle which very few Indians know about. And it's a nationalist film. It's a nationalist war film with the trappings of all the trappings of nationalist cinema in it, and it could not be otherwise.
Hmm. Hmm.
The point is, they made a film on the Battle of Chushul. Okay,
Hmm.
on Razangla Chushul. This is that battle. Okay, uh, but no Indian filmmaker could make a film on what happened in the Northeast, where the Indian army and the Indian civil administration was completely routed by the fear of the Chinese invasion.
Hmm.
You see, these two theaters of war, the war took place in two theaters, the Eastern Theater and the Northern Theater, right? In Ladakh, the Battle of Chushul Razangla is a good battle which the Indian army fought. You have a very, very bad looking and rather, you know, rather lonely and, I would say rather pathetic sort of uh, obelisk raised to Major Shaitan Singh in that area. When you go towards the Pangong, so you pass that, and
Hmm.
the tourist taxi walas don't even stop there for people to have a look at that place.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I remember going there in 2009. I had gone there, and thankfully the army had taken care of me because somebody in the army knew me. And our driver was just about to race past it because we spent the night in Razangla, and he was racing. And I said, "What is this?" He said, "This is some यहाँ कोई नहीं रुकता है." So I said, "नहीं नहीं हम रुकेंगे." Then I realized it is the memorial of Major Shaitan
Dancing.
Singh, and that's the place where the Razangla Chushul battle took place. So we don't even know how to. I mean, we are a country which, I mean, leave alone critically analyzing defeats. I think we don't even know how to celebrate our victories properly.
Hmm. Hmm.
So poor is our historical sensibility, and so overwhelming is the need to conform to nationalist narratives all the time. So scared we are of being critical about our own recent past as historians.
Hmm.
So I would like to see a Bollywood filmmaker make a film on the Northeast during the Chinese War.
Right.
That's when I will say that you can actually make a war film. I mean, you can never make a war film in this country like the Americans have made war films about Vietnam.
Agreed.
You
Agreed.
see, if you look at a beautiful film made by the German filmmaker Josef Wilsmeyer, I think in 1993. It's a film called, it has a simple name, it's called Stalingrad. That's the film, that's the sort of film you can never make here.